We must save Kiev. We must get ahead of the incendiaries. We must outrun death. Kiev waits. It waits in deadly anguish. Without Kiev, there is no Ukraine. There is no homeland without Kiev. Here beside the venerable Dnipro, formidable battles have raged. The fate of Kiev depends upon them. Our destiny, too, depends upon them. If we drive the Germans from Kiev, they will retreat to Germany. The Germans want Kiev to become their strong point. Kiev must become their grave. Welcome to Beyond Barbarossa, the first English-language podcast in the world to focus on the Eastern Front of World War II. This is episode 61, and by the end, you'll see just how the USSR defeated Nazi Germany in the Second World War. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting from the Redbeard Studio on traditional Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, also called Ottawa. This episode looks at the Second Battle of Kyiv in the Second World War. There were other battles of Kiev over the centuries, including a big one in the 21st century. But this podcast is all about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. And we're looking at 1943. Last episode showed how the Red Army pushed the Germans back from Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine west to the banks of the Dnipro River, and then crossed it at great cost and casualties. The episode described the Soviet airborne attack across the river into the Bukrin bend, which was a disaster for the Red Army. Even so, that crossing and other Soviet bridgeheads up and down the Dnipro River showed how the Germans were clearly on the defensive at this point. Since Stalingrad, that is, throughout 1943, the Germans retreated steadily. Yes, they made some advances, such as at Kharkiv, but those were quickly followed by retreats. Kursk and Kharkiv were the biggest examples of this. Yes, the Germans did exact terrible casualties on the advancing Red Army, but in 1943, they had no choice but to retreat. Here, historians have described a repeated pattern here. Generals like Manstein and Kluge would advocate building defenses behind the front lines. Hitler resists this, saying that rear defenses only encourage the soldiers to retreat. Instead, he orders the officers on the ground to hold the line. The Soviets, with seemingly unending numbers of soldiers and seemingly infinite Lend-Lease supply, weaken the Germans to the point that they have to withdraw. Hitler says, "See, I told you, having those defenses behind them just gives the soldiers the incentive to retreat." But because of Hitler's orders not to build defensive positions behind the lines, when the soldiers have to retreat to those lines, whatever defenses are there are inadequate. That leads to a whole another round of this cycle. Depending on which side you're on, it's either a vicious or a virtuous cycle. Let's focus on one specific example. Kiev, 1943. We're still dealing with the same period as last episode, episode 60, and that period is late autumn 1943. So we're going to skip the what else is happening in the war feature this time around, except to say in Italy, the Americans, British, and Canadian forces are advancing slowly and painfully up north along the Italian boot, the Italians having given Mussolini the boot themselves and joined the Western Allies. The Germans have been pouring more divisions into Italy in an effort to stem the invasion. And in the Pacific, the American island hopping campaign continues. and they find that the Japanese are not easy to dislodge. In short, the Axis is well past its high point of 1942. The thing is, neither side knows that at the time. It's still, as far as the people there at the time were concerned, the war could still go either way. And now, let's focus on Kiev. The Germans captured the capital of Ukraine in autumn 1941, following the greatest single encirclement and capture of soldiers in history. Over 600,000 people, whole armies, captured at one time. From there, the Germans swept across the rest of Ukraine, taking Kharkiv and then crossing the Don River in 1942 on their way to Stalingrad. You can recap this in episode 31 in season 2. There's a link in the show notes. The Battle of Stalingrad was a real turning point in the war, not only on the Eastern Front, but around the world. From there, the Red Army pushed the Germans back steadily. Why? Well, there's a lot of debate about this, a lot of different interpretations of it. From the way I see it, by this point, the Germans were steadily losing arms, planes, tanks, and most important, people faster than they can replenish them. Meanwhile, the Soviet forces kept growing through this time. They brought dozens of new armies, and this is whole armies, so tens of thousands of people, in fact, in total, millions of new soldiers, to the front. Also, they were increasing the amount of armaments they had. The factories that they had moved east in the first weeks of the war, by 1943, were operating at full steam. And the most important thing to remember here is Lend-Lease. Millions of tons of supplies from the West. Food, ammunition, planes, tanks, even trains. Mostly from the United States, but also from Canada, the UK, and elsewhere. Another factor that's important at this point is that, as I mentioned before, the Allies are now in Italy, and the Germans have had to take divisions from the Eastern Front and deploy them in Italy. Obviously, this weakens the forces in Russia and Ukraine. One of the last major German offensives on the Eastern Front was at Kursk in late July and August of 1943. While some may call it a tactical victory for the Germans, and I've seen that in a few books, and I mentioned that in earlier episodes. So in a sense, you could say, yeah, the Germans did well because they inflicted far more Soviet casualties than they suffered. Overall, it was a defeat. It was a strategic win for the Red Army, because the Red Army halted the Germans, and the Germans ultimately fell back. And through the rest of the fall, so as I described earlier, all along the Eastern Front, they withdrew to a defensive line, a recently constructed defensive line, the so-called Wotan line. So let's zoom in and look at the situation on the Dnipro River at the beginning of November 1943. And I'll start again with Kiev, which is right on the Dnipro River. Since the Germans captured the city in 1941, Kiev has suffered an unimaginably brutal occupation. The retreating Red Army had damaged infrastructure as part of its scorched earth retreat. Parts of the city had no electricity or even water. When the Germans came in, they installed their own city administration, abbreviated in Ukrainian as KGU. This included its own police force, in addition to the previously existing Kiev police and other occupying forces like the SS, the Einsatzgruppen, and others. And it got really confusing who was in charge, who had the most power. These different organizations competed with each other. It was a really bad situation if you were just an ordinary citizen. The Germans distributed propaganda and so-called educational material. They ran the public health, transport, housing, everything a normal city administration does. The Germans fired the first mayor they put in under this sham administration, and they executed the second one because he was collaborating with resistance groups on both the communist and nationalist side. Kiev suffered terrible food shortages once the Germans occupied it. So the Germans told the people to grow their own food in gardens. This wasn't very effective because, well, for one thing, it was hard to find seeds. But then it got worse because the Germans started requisitioning whatever food was grown to give to their own soldiers. They also prohibited families, Ukrainian families, from keeping more than one day's food. And when they finally appeared, the ration cards they distributed only allowed citizens 200 grams of bread per day. Overall, the Germans saw Ukrainians as slaves. They deported 120,000 Kievans to work in German farms, factories, etc. They enforced compulsory registration of all residents between the ages of 16 to 65 in order to fill work quotas, because there's still work to be done, growing food or fixing pipes or whatever, in Kiev, but 120,000 workers have been sent west. Anyone who did not comply with this registration requirement was subject to exile, being turfed out of the city, torture, or death. Eventually, the deportations and murders meant there weren't enough workers left in Kiev to do the jobs that the Germans felt were beneath them. So they forced children from age 11 to 14 to fill the labor roles left by the exiled. They also used children as involuntary blood donors for German soldiers. And the Germans suspended education. I mean, how much education do slaves need? One of the first things they did after occupying the city was to execute Jews, communists, nationalists, and anyone else they felt like killing. They dumped the bodies in a ravine in Kiev called Babin Yar, or Babi Yar, depending on how you pronounce it. Up to 120,000 Kievans were killed during the occupation. 100,000 dumped into the Babin Yar ravine alone. Tens of thousands more starved to death in those 2 years. During the occupation, not just in Kiev but across Ukraine, partisans or guerrilla resistance fighters were really active. And the Nazis took a savage revenge whenever partisans struck. The Germans would often go to a town where there had been some sort of operation and killed all the males there in response to a single German death. The result of all this? By autumn 1943, the population of Kiev was a fifth of the pre-war level, which was close to 1 million. And by the autumn of 1943, there were only 186,000 people left. As the Red Army advanced across Ukraine, the SS realized the karma they were facing. So they forced Ukrainian workers to exhume thousands of bodies from Babin Yar and burn them in an attempt to hide the evidence. Then the SS killed the workers who had dug up the bodies and burned their bodies too. So what was the attitude then of the survivors in Kiev? Historian Prit Butar cites a change in the mood among Ukrainians through 1942 as news of German losses and Red Army advances trickled into the city. Quote, "But whilst some greeted with enthusiasm the news that the Red Army had briefly recaptured Kharkov, others were more concerned about the return of Soviet authority and particularly NKVD repression." End quote. So that's the situation in the capital city. Let's take a look now at the front. As described last episode, Army Group South withdrew behind the Dnipro, that is, west of the Great River, by the end of September 1943. Because the West Bank still is, higher than the East, the Germans had an unobstructed view of whoever's coming from the eastern side. And they thought that gave them a great, excellent defensive position. They weren't wrong. It was a great position for viewing. But, as I described earlier, the physical defenses they constructed were not that solid and not that prevalent. There were a lot of gaps. On top of that, and this is probably the most salient fact, the men were exhausted and severely under strength. Since the withdrawal from Kursk in August, Army Group South had suffered 200,000 casualties. On the other hand, through October, the Red Army managed to cross the Dnipro at several places, from Lyutezh in the north, which is today at the border of Belarus and Ukraine, down to the Black Sea at Kherson. They had also pushed past the town of Perekop, so they had penetrated the Wotan line where it diverged from the Dnipro at Zaporizhzhia and went straight down south to the Sea of Azov. And yes, there's a map on the website. I will show this. So the Red Army had pushed past that point up to the Dnipro River. They went past the town of Perekop, which is the isthmus connecting the Crimean Peninsula to the mainland. Thus, they trapped the German 17th Army on the peninsula. In the Kiev sector, the Germans had deployed the 4th Panzer Army under Generaloberst Hermann Hott, one of the most experienced commanders on the Eastern Front. This unit had fought at Stalingrad in the North Caucasus on the Kuban Steppe, at Kursk, and then all the way back across Ukraine. By the fall, it was seriously depleted. In total, it numbered less than 277,000 men, and not all of those were combat soldiers. There were officers, there were quartermasters, there were cooks and drivers, and so on. Against this army, the Red Army deployed the entire Voronezh front, which was then renamed the First Ukrainian Front. And this is a group of armies, not one army. In October 1943, the First Ukrainian Front numbered some 730,000 men, almost 3 times as many as the Germans. They had 7,000 guns and mortars, 675 tanks and assault guns, and 700 combat aircraft. As you can see, these are overwhelming numbers, and that was the basis of the Soviet strategy in 1943, as it is today for the Russians. So now, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll look at the Red Army's initiative to recapture the Ukrainian capital. Hi, Scott here. I hope you're enjoying this episode and that you get a lot out of the whole podcast. Beyond Barbarossa is still, as far as I can tell, the only English language podcast in the world that focuses on the Eastern Front of World War II. If you do like it and you want to help me keep it going, please give it a rating or a review on Apple, Google, Amazon, Podbean, or whatever podcasting platform you listen to it on. That helps let other people know about it. Patreon's another way you can support the podcast, my research, and podcasting expenses. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and sign up at whatever level of support you choose. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to new episodes, as well as exclusive bonus episodes. Check it out, won't you? Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. Thanks.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more on my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel, and all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and traditions. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
Thanks for coming back. As described last episode, the Soviet assault on Bukrin Bend began with an airborne assault. But it failed, leaving 3 Red armies tied down in this loop in the river. So the Soviet High Command, Stavka, decided to shift focus to a smaller bridgehead at Lyutezh, 150 kilometers or 100 miles north of Bukrin, but only 30 kilometers north of Kiev. That bridgehead, little bit of land, was held by the 38th Army, which had crossed the Great River at corresponding great cost and casualties starting on 26 September. While the Lyutezh bridgehead was smaller than the one at Bukrin, the terrain there was flatter, and the terrain between there and Kiev, importantly, was flatter, and more conducive to large-scale tank operations. It wasn't perfect. There were a lot of small rivers and streams that could be obstacles for tanks. So, the 5th Guards Tank Corps, part of the 3rd Guards Tank Army, spent some time waterproofing their tanks as much as they could. And then, on 11th October, they headed out at full speed, splashing across all those streams and rivers. They lost a number of tanks on the way, but most of them got through to the outskirts of the Ukrainian capital, and they were followed by the rest of the army. They struck the Germans at the meeting point between Army Group Center to the north and Manstein's Army Group South. Opposing them was the badly degraded 8th Panzer Division, which had only 1,000 men left and 7 Panzer IIIs and IVs, reinforced by 2 battle groups, so mostly infantry, from the 7th and 8th Panzer Divisions. This gave the Soviets an advantage in infantry of 4-1, 4 times as many Red Army soldiers as there were Germans in the Wehrmacht. The Soviets broke through the German lines, but even with this advantage, they were unable to widen the breach. The Germans fought back hard, including using air raids. But even so, despite their superiority in leadership and weaponry and tactics, they could not withstand this advance. So on the 17th of October, they withdrew, leaving the Soviet bridgehead stronger than it had been a week earlier. Meanwhile, back at the Bukrin bridgehead, 150 kilometers south, the 3rd Guards Tank Army quietly pulled back east of the river. To deceive the Germans, they left behind wooden mock-ups of tanks and some radio teams to broadcast as if the whole army was still in the area. The 27th Red Army also remained in the bend or in the bridgehead, and they conducted a series of feints against the Germans, as if there were still a major force there. According to author Pat McTaggart, writing in the Warfare History Network, quote, "With intense secrecy, Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army slipped out of the bridgehead and began the trek to Ljutesch, about 150 kilometers to the north, while other forces inside the bridgehead continued to patrol, fooling the Germans into thinking that all 3 armies were still in the area." End quote. Despite fuel shortages, the poor conditions of the roads northward, and few crossings over the Desna River, which is a tributary of the Dnipro, the 3rd Guards tanks were in position in Lyutizh by 1st November. They joined a formidable array of forces, the 38th Army with a new commander, Kirill Moskalenko, a Ukrainian whose last name means from Moscow. There was the 5th Guards Tank Corps, the independent 1st Czechoslovak Infantry Brigade, a unit of the Czechoslovak armed forces that had escaped the Germans and fought alongside the Red Army through most of the war. There was also the 7th Breakthrough Artillery Corps and the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps. The Germans were also getting ready. They anticipated that the Red Army's next attack would come from the north of Kiev. So they transferred in several units, hoping to hold the Soviets back long enough to give their other units time to rest, repair, and rebuild. The Red Army Command held a meeting on 1st November in the town of Novopetrovsky. Attending were Colonel Svoboda of the Czechoslovak Infantry Brigade, the political officers, artillery commanders, and Marshal Vatutin, commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front himself, as well as his various deputies and chiefs of staff of the other armies, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself, Stalin's right hand. General Moskalenko of the 38th Army presented his plan for the breakthrough to take Kiev in time for the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which is 7th November. Zhukov apparently questioned Moskalenko's tactic of a narrow breakthrough. Zhukov thought that concentrating the forces into a narrow front would enable the enemy to concentrate fire. Moskalenko pointed out that the approach was through a forested area, so it provided a certain amount of cover, and it would enhance the element of surprise. Marshal Vatutin supported Moskalenko's plan, so Zhukov eventually went along with it. Then, at 0800 on 3rd November, the Red Army artillery opened up on German positions around the Lyutezh bridgehead. General Moskalenko described it this way, quote, "The high density of artillery that we had created made itself felt. The enemy's defenses were literally swept away. As we saw later, all his trenches, lines of communication, firing positions, and bunkers were destroyed. As a result, reports began to arrive soon after the attack began that our troops had advanced easily up to 2 kilometers into the depth of the enemy defenses. The few surviving enemy soldiers and officers fled. Many dead Hitlerites were found in the firing positions and trenches, together with large quantities of abandoned guns and ammunition." End quote. After 40 minutes of bombardment, the tanks and infantry began moving, crossing rivers on engineered bridges submerged just below the surface. The Germans probably knew they were coming. It's impossible to completely hide a moving army of that size, but they had no way to stop it. They were too few to put up a defense against such a large concentration of forces. By the end of the 4th November, so after 2 solid days of fighting, the Red Army was at the western and northwestern edges of Kiev. However, the army that had been moved from Bukrin specially for this operation, the 3rd Guards Tank Army, found it going a lot slower. So, its commander, General Pavel Rybalko, ordered a nighttime attack. This started with another artillery bombardment, and then the tanks and all the other vehicles turned on all their lights. With headlights blazing and horns and sirens howling, they raced eastward toward the city. The tanks overwhelmed the Germans at Sviatoshinsky, a suburb on the capital's western edge. This also cut the road from Kiev west to Zhytomyr. The Germans began to withdraw their limited forces that were still in the city, but they had to go through a more roundabout route than that highway straight to Zhytomyr. The Soviet 3rd Tank Army penetrated the city proper from the west, while the 38th Army fought through the northern suburbs starting on 5th November. The German 80th Infantry Division remained in the city fighting hard, defending every street and strong point. Quote, "In street battles reminiscent of Stalingrad, the Soviets destroyed position after position. The fighting raged into the night, with Major General Heinrich Roth, commander of the 88th, becoming one of the German casualties. Most of the area was back in Russian hands and the enemy was fleeing." End quote. And that was from Pat McTaggart's essay in the Warfare History Network. By the end of 6 November, General Moskalenko sent a report to the High Command that the entire city had been taken. He said liberated, but when it comes to the Soviet Union, I don't use that word. He reported that they had taken the city of Kiev and they had captured 6,000 prisoners. That is 1/100th the number the Germans had taken at Kiev 2 years previously. But yeah, the circumstances were completely different, and let's face it, by end of 1943, I doubt that there were many more than 6,000 Germans to take in Kiev. Finally, on 7th November 1943, the 26th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviets declared they had recaptured Kiev. Their prize was, well, I'll let General Rybalko describe it. There were ruins and fires everywhere, ugly piles of rubble where the beautiful buildings had stood. Avenues of chestnut trees and the famous poplars had been cut down or burned. Kreshchatyk was littered with rubble. Statues of Marx, Sverdlov, and others had been toppled. there were smoking tanks and self-propelled guns everywhere. At first, not a soul was to be seen in the city of almost 1 million people. As they left Kiev, the fascists had driven the inhabitants from the city. The survivors hid in cellars, in the crypts of cemeteries, or had escaped into the woods, and listened anxiously to the cannonade and explosions that thundered in the city. Only when it grew quiet did the people realize that the Red Army was back in the city. Exhausted by the atrocities of the occupiers and after all their humiliation and deprivation, the Kiev citizens hugged their liberators with gratitude." End quote. Most of the damage to the city was done in the first battle in 1941, and by the delayed detonation bombs that the Red Army had left behind their retreat. Over the following 2 years, the Red Air Force had repeatedly bombed the city, and the Germans had not bothered to repair the damage. Their policy, after all, was to erase all Slavic cities, and ultimately all Slavs. But November 7, 1943, the city was now in Soviet hands, under Soviet control, and would remain so for another 46 years. And what happens after that is beyond the scope of this podcast. Maybe I'll get to that in the future, in a different podcast. But for now, let's take a look at the immediate aftermath in 1943. After recapturing Kiev, Vatutin's First Ukrainian Front did not take a break. Nope. They pressed on to exploit their costly success immediately. Even though they had concentrated the assault on Kiev into a narrow front, that was Moskalenko's idea, remember? And that had worked out. Blitzkrieg, like the narrow spear point, and then you widen it and exploit the breach. Vatutin changed his approach immediately after the capture of the city. He split his forces into two, a move that many historians call a mistake. Some forces went directly west towards Zhytomyr and to take on the Germans that were retreating that way, and hopefully encircle them. And another group went southwest, hoping to capture Hitler's eastern headquarters, the Führerhauptquartier Werwolf, or Werewolf headquarters, at Vinnytsia. Success here would threaten all of Army Group South's rear. How did that work out? Well, I've been talking for quite a while now. Looking at the timer here, it's around 34 minutes so far. So I think that's long enough. You've made it to work by now or back home, depending on when you listen to this podcast. So let's tackle that question in the next episode. For now, I'd like to say thank you for listening to another episode of Beyond Barbarossa, the podcast about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. As always, I've posted maps and photos on the web page for this episode, so you can see just where Kiev is and the Lyutezh bridgehead and all that stuff. You can find it at beyondbarbarossa.ca or beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com. There, click on the title of this episode, the title to get to those maps and so on, not the picture, unless you want to listen to the episode in your web browser, and if you do, that's great. You can also listen to the episode on my own website, writtenword.ca, and click on the podcast button in the banner. Remember, you can get all episodes early and ad-free through Patreon. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose the level of support you're comfortable with. I want to thank all who are now supporting the podcast through Patreon or otherwise, and everyone who's following. If you like this episode, please consider following Beyond Barbarossa on your preferred podcasting app. And I'd really appreciate a rating on Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, Podbean, or wherever you listen. That really helps spread the word to others interested in history. Do you have a question, a comment, an addition to make? Did you notice anything I've said that you disagree with? I hope there's none, but there might be an error. Well, let me and all the other listeners know. All you have to do is send an email to contact@beyondbarbarossa.ca, or you can send a message to the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Burry. I'm Scott Burry. Until next time, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina.